is going down. And you know what's going down with him? White European Jesus. Because this image, which has always been false, we know it's false, has been a signal for too long that Jesus, the Christ, belongs to white people. But you know what? Jesus was a brown-skinned Palestinian Jew. We know roughly what his skin looked like. And let me assure you, it wasn't pasty white. Yet we have continued to represent him this way. And it's a slap in the face to our black and brown brothers and sisters all over the globe. And it's time for this image to come down and for this entire white supremacist system to come down right along with it.
And, they get more money if they have a son. If they have a daughter, they get money for that too, but less money. Native Americans get reparations for the crimes that were committed against their people. But how come black people don't get reparations? Why do black people not get reparations, but will send $100 billion to Ukraine, or will bring in migrants, give them free housing, free food, and cash, but black people cannot get reparations? Please explain that to me, because I don't fucking understand it.
Black angels were in the kitchen preparing the milk and honey. She said, listen, you quit saying that, boy. I was always curious, and I always wondered why I had to die to go to heaven. Why I couldn't have pretty cars and good money and nice homes now. Why do I have to wait till I die to get milk and honey? And I said, Mama, I don't want no milk and honey. I like steaks and I said, milk and honey is a laxative anyway. Did they have a lot of bathrooms in heaven? So anyway, I was always curious. I always wondered why. Tarzan is the king of the jungle in Africa. He was white. And, white man. I saw this white man swinging around Africa with a diaper on, hollering, oh! Do you all see Tarzan over here? Did you see Tarzan? Yeah. And all the Africans, he's beating them up and breaking the lion's jaw. And here's Tarzan talking to the animals, and the Africans been there for centuries, and he yet can't talk to the animals. Only Tarzan can talk to the animals. I always wondered why. And Miss America was always white. All the beautiful brown women in America, beautiful suntans, beautiful shapes, all type complexions, but she always was white. And Miss World was always white. And Miss Universe was always white. And then they got some stuff called White House cigars, White Swan soap, King White soap, White Cloud tissue paper, White Rain hair rinse, White Tornado floor wax. Everything was white. And the angel food cake was the white cake, and the devil food cake was the chocolate cake. I said, Mama, why is everything white? I always wondered, and the president lived in the White House. And Mary had a little lamb, his feet as white as snow, and Snow White. And everything was white. Santa Claus was white. And everything bad was black. The little ugly duckling was the black duck, and the black cat was the bad luck. And if I threaten you, I'm going to blackmail you. I said, Mama, why don't they call it white mail? They lied too. I was always curious. And this is when I knew something was wrong.
One of the things that used to really haunt me about our nation is how easily things could have gone differently for the black community at several points in our history. They would have radically shifted where we are today in 2026. I mean, we could have easily given freed slaves 40 acres and a mule. Easily. But instead we gave them Jim Crow and another 100 years of racialized terror and labor exploitation. After the Civil Rights era, we could have funded MLK's Poor People's Campaign. But instead, we funded the war on drugs that, again, terrorized the poorest black communities across this nation rather than empowering them. And all of this used to really haunt me. But what I've been hearing the Lord saying is that He has used all of it, all of the affliction, all of the heartache, all of the pain and the suffering, to prepare for Himself a people for this specific time in history. The black community in America, says the Lord, has been forged in the furnace of affliction and held in a place of derision. But now I, says the Lord, I am turning the tide and lifting them to a place of great honor and they will lead in this next season like never before.
The president has been talking for a while about the reparations that are owed when it comes to the transatlantic slave trade. And on Wednesday, yesterday, the UN Assembly got together and they voted on a measure that would call the transatlantic slave trade the greatest crime against humanity. Now, in this measure, it is talking about not only recognizing that the transatlantic slave trade was the greatest atrocity against humanity in history, but it would also call for the return of stolen artifacts from Africa, as well as reparations, even though it doesn't go into details about what those reparations are. Now, the resolution actually passed with 123 votes in favor, but notably, many of the European countries, including the UK and France, abstained. About 52 countries abstained from the vote, and 3 countries actively voted against it. Those 3 countries, you will be very surprised to know, are the United States, Is Not So Real, and Argentina. Interestingly enough, Is Not So Real and the United States are currently locked together in a war with Iran, and Argentina got about $40 billion from the Bone Spurs administration in 2025. But even with that, the measure passed. And like I said, the president of Ghana has been spearheading this whole movement, saying that the trafficking and racial chattel enslavement of Africans is the greatest crime against humanity because of its definitive break in world history, the scale, the duration, the systemic nature, the brutality and enduring consequences that continue to structure the lives of all people. But like I said, many countries, including the US, didn't want to sign on to this measure because of the mention of reparations. The US saying that it does not recognize the legal right to reparations for historical wrongs that were not illegal under international law at the time that they occurred. So basically, because chattel slavery at the time was legal and the treatment and the brutality against those people were legal at the time, they shouldn't have to either acknowledge that, recognize that, or pay reparations towards the people who are living with that history that still continues. And the thing about that, and the one reason why many of the other European countries, the countries that had something to do with the transatlantic slave trade, the reason why, especially the United States, if they were to actually recognize that Black Americans specifically deserve reparations for the things that have happened because of the transatlantic slave trade, they wouldn't only have to recognize the transatlantic slave trade. They would have to recognize all of the things that they did to Black Americans when they got here. The 400 years of slavery, buck breaking, breeding farms, medical experiments on Black women that gave us the gynecology that we use today. The using of Black babies as bait for alligators. Using our flesh to bind books and lampshades. Using our hair to stuff pillows and furniture. Having us as the main course during a family picnic. After which, taking bodily souvenirs home to display. And not only would they have to address those atrocities during the 400 years of slavery in this country, they would have to address the atrocities that happened afterwards, which is usually where the disconnect lies. A lot of people would love to say that slavery was 400 years ago. First of all, it wasn't. It lasted for 400 years. It wasn't 400 years ago. But even after that, they would have to answer for not giving Black people 40 acres and a mule. They would have to answer for when Black people did go and become mayors and become governors and start their own businesses and their own banks, and they started thriving, why it was that those mayors and governors always found themselves unalived, why those towns always found themselves decimated, why thriving Black towns were always stormed and massacred. They would have to answer for Jim Crow laws. They would have to answer for the strange fruit in those trees. They would have to answer for the burning crosses. They would have to answer for the Black towns underwater, for destroying Black towns to put in highways. They would have to answer for the Emmett Tills. They would have to answer for stealing Black inventions, preventing those Black families from reaping the wealth of their intellect. They would have to answer for segregation, keeping Black people from good education and job opportunities. They would have to answer for redlining, mass incarceration, the CIA pumping narcotics into our neighborhoods and paying people who look like us to sell those narcotics on our streets. They would have to answer for the continuation of mass incarceration of Black people in this country, especially since the rate of exoneration for those people who are imprisoned is about 7 times more than anyone else. They would have to answer to the school to prison pipeline, where they intentionally target our youth for prisons and not for college. They would have to answer for why the mortality rate of Black women in this country is 2 times higher than the second runner-up. There is a reason why the United States refuses to recognize a legal right to reparations for Black Americans. Because even though the transatlantic slave trade ended, the enslavement of Black Americans took on many forms in many ways over time. The targeting, the systematic targeting of Black people continues to this day. And if Black people were to truly get what they are owed from this country, from the loss and the pain and the generational trauma that has been inflicted, not only on our ancestors generations ago who were forced to forget their names, their languages, and their gods, but today, where your name can lose you a job opportunity, affecting your family's wealth, where over 300,000 Black women are out of work just because of the deletion of DEI, in which Black women were the 7th demographic to even benefit from DEIA policies in the first place. In order for this country to truly atone via reparations to the Black Americans in this country, they would go bankrupt. They could pay every Black American a monthly check for the end of time and still not come close to what is owed to Black people, based on solely the atrocities of the things that they have done to Black people in this country. This is why they don't even want to touch the recognition of reparations for Black Americans. They know what they owe is too much. They will never be able to repay what they have done. And this is why they spend more time erasing the history of the atrocities that they created, rather than trying to put in place measures that would actually begin healing. The U.S. knows what it did and what it continues to do to the Black community and Black Americans in this country. And they know that that is a debt that they could never repay.
The recent Supreme Court decision in Louisiana versus Calais effectively killed the last remaining provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was authored by Justice Samuel Alito, but it represents the life's work of Chief Justice John Roberts. The Roberts Court has now gutted the Voting Rights Act on 3 different occasions, and Roberts wrote or joined every one of those opinions. And that's not an accident. Roberts has been trying to kill the Voting Rights Act for more than 40 years, and it looks like he's finally succeeded. Roberts' crusade against the Voting Rights Act dates back to the early 1980s, when he was a young lawyer in Ronald Reagan's Justice Department. The Reagan administration was locked in a fight with Congress over whether to reauthorize parts of the Voting Rights Act and how strong the Voting Rights Act should be. Roberts took the position that the Voting Rights Act should be as weak as possible. Roberts claimed the Voting Rights Act would lead to a quota system in all areas, essentially comparing the law to affirmative action in the voting process. Roberts actually lost that fight in the early 1980s. The Congress overwhelmingly reauthorized and strengthened the Voting Rights Act with strong bipartisan support. But Roberts resurrected his crusade against the Voting Rights Act when he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 2005. Roberts claimed in his confirmation hearings that the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act was a settled question. But once he got on the bench, he quickly got to work in dismantling the country's most important civil rights law. In the 2013 decision, Shelby County versus Holder, Roberts wrote the majority opinion, ruling that states with a long history of discrimination no longer had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. He claimed that things had changed dramatically in the South. But in the wake of his decision, 31 states have passed more than 115 new voter suppression efforts. Roberts claimed in the Shelby County decision that his opinion in no way affected the other major part of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, which banned racial discrimination in voting nationwide. But the Roberts Court quickly started attacking that part of the law as well. In the 2021 case Brnovich versus DNC, authored by Alito and joined by Roberts, the Roberts Court made it much harder for voters of color to challenge discriminatory voting laws. And then in the recent Louisiana versus Calais decision, the Roberts Court struck down a second majority black congressional district in Louisiana and imperiled majority minority districts all across the country, leading potentially to the largest drop in black representation since the end of Reconstruction. They have now narrowed Section 2 and the Voting Rights Act overall to the point of irrelevance. The defining cause of Roberts and the Roberts Court has been rolling back the civil rights revolution of the 1960s. And it's clear they're not going to moderate on this issue anytime soon. That's why, if you want to protect civil rights in America, we have to have a new Supreme Court.